All right, here we go with the 9.1 to 9.4 review worksheet answers. So just go through and kind of give yourself some feedback as you watch this video, and then make sure to upload your assignment to Teams when you're all done. Okay, so this was a worksheet. So if you have a printer, that's awesome. If you don't, you can just go ahead and write this out like on a piece of notebook paper and take a picture. But number one gave us this little arrow, pre-image, and image, and it says, is it a rigid motion or not, basically? So I said, yes, it is a rigid motion because it looks like it's a rotation, right? It kind of looks like we're just turning it a little bit. And both of the images are the same size. But in number two, this is not a rigid motion because the image ends up being smaller than the pre-image. And that's actually a dilation, which we'll talk about in section 9.6 tomorrow. Number three, it asks you to find the rule for the translation. So it gives you this little graph on your paper. And then I just took what I had handwritten down because it's a little easier to write this than it is to type it. So it looks like going from my pre-image, which is this HYWN, right? This one that's over here on the right. We know that it's going to this one over here on the left because it has the prime notation, right? So I know this is my pre-image, this is my image. So that means I'm going backwards 2 in the X direction and down 1 in the Y direction. So I said T for translation, and then -2 in the X direction, -1 in the Y direction. And you could just have this part. You don't necessarily have to say HNWY, or down here I put the option. You could say like X comma Y, and it goes to X prime, Y prime. Really what I need to see that you have is, do you have the T and do you have the -2, -1, right? That's how we write the rule. What I notice a lot of the times when I do this, when people aren't paying attention, is they want to just go from left to right. So sometimes people will have +2, +1. If you don't have those negatives, I'm guessing that you went from the image to the pre-image rather than going from the pre-image to the image. So just pay attention to that. On 4 through 6, it asks you to draw the image of each figure for the given transformation. So sorry, for some reason my scan turned out kind of like orangey yellow, but I wanted that highlighting orange on there rather than just turning it black and white. So this one, it tells us to take our ABCD rectangle and reflect it over the x-axis. Remember that capital R means reflect. So I highlighted my x-axis and then I just counted each of my points, right? So also remember that when you label points for reflections, I'm not just taking this rectangle and shifting it up, right? So I'm not taking A and just moving it all the way to the top. I'm taking A, it's 1 away from the x-axis, it's 1 away in the opposite direction, right? D is 3 away and 3 away. C is also 3 and 3, and B is 1 and 1, right? So it should look like an exact mirror image. And don't forget to label your points. I put that as feedback on some people's homework on Teams. Sometimes I'm just seeing some rectangles with no points. On number 5, it asked us to rotate, right? The lowercase r is rotate. Rotate 90 degrees around the origin. Remember we talked about our sort of standard notation, or kind of what we do always for rotations if it's positive degree is to go counterclockwise. If it was negative, we would go clockwise, but we're not going to use that convention at all. We're just going to stick with those positive counterclockwise rotations. So you could do that thing that we did where you just kind of turn your paper and regraph it and then turn it back. Or if you remember, we had that pattern that told us that we could take each point, flip the X and the Y, and make the first new point negative. So I actually wrote out all of my A, B, C, D points and then went through and just kind of did that math where I take the X and the Y, I flip it, I make the first point negative, or if it's already negative, right, for C, I made it positive. So either way that you do it, you should end up with your A, B, C, D prime right here, kind of floating over the y-axis. For number 6, it asks us to reflect over y equals 2. Capital R is reflect. So here's y equals 2 right here, and then take each point, reflect it, and make sure that you have each of those points labeled with prime notation. Number 7, it says to graph. This looks like a glide reflection, right? We have a translation here and then a reflection. So I started by graphing O, N, M. So that's this black triangle that's right here, O, N, M. And then it tells us to do this kind of rule that's here. Remember, we have to start on glide reflections with the translation, and then we move to the reflection. So first I did my translation, moved it 3 to the right, so 3 in the positive direction in the x-axis. You don't have to have this kind of gray in between shape labeled, but remember that it's just kind of good to show it. So it's kind of like the second step of showing your work. just in case you did something incorrectly when we're trying to get down to this reflection down here. So then I reflected it over y equals 1. So here's my line, y equals 1 sketched in there, took each point and reflected it, and there we go. So I think we mentioned that you can just call this O prime, M prime, and N prime, and maybe just not even bother kind of with labeling your in-between shape. So either way, you should end up with this orange shape down here, and make sure you have it labeled somehow with some kind of prime notation. Number 8, looks like we're doing a translation. So -3 in the x direction, +4 in the y direction. So pretty basic, just take everything, -3 on the x, +4 on the y, and there's your DEF prime there. Make sure your points are labeled. So 1 through 4 on the back, I just went ahead and did all of these all at once. Number 1 and number 4 to me don't quite look like standard glide reflections. Because on number 1, if you notice, you're translating it 3 in the positive x direction, and so we move it kind of in the horizontal direction, but then we have to reflect it over this vertical y-axis. So that's technically, we're not reflecting it over a line that's parallel to the translation, but we basically just need to follow what the rule says, right? It's a composite transformation. We're doing 2 things at once, so just follow the directions, right? 3 in the x direction, reflect over the y-axis. So here's my 3 in the x direction translation, and then here's my reflect over the y-axis. So again, your points might be labeled slightly differently. Maybe you just have M prime, D prime, and L prime over here. But just make sure your orange triangle is in the same place here. Number 2, this one is a traditional glide reflection because we're taking this original triangle DML and we're moving it up 1 on the y-axis, and then we're reflecting it over that line that's parallel to the translation. So you should end up with your DML triangle over here. So D double prime for me, L double prime, and M double prime. On number 3, again, this is a traditional glide reflection because we're shifting it kind of horizontally, and then we're reflecting it also over a horizontal line. So I moved it -1 in the x direction based on my translation here, and then I reflected it over y equals 1, and then here's my point where it ends up here. Number 4, again, I said this one doesn't really look like a traditional glide reflection to me, but we just follow what the rule tells us to do, right? So T3 means we translate right 3 and up 3. So here's my kind of in-between shape. And then y equals 2, there's my line right there, reflect it over, and there should be your new image. So again, because we're kind of, right, we're translating it sort of in this direction, and then we're reflecting it over this line. Well, obviously those 2 lines are not parallel to each other, so not a traditional glide reflection. Again, just stick with the rule that it gives you and just kind of follow those rules that it tells you to do. 5, 6, and 7, it says to identify each mapping. So is it a translation, reflection, rotation, or a glide reflection? And then we're writing the rules. So number 5, this one's clearly a reflection. And if I sketched in a line, it would go right through here. And so that line is at -3 on the x-axis. So I'm reflecting capital R, x equals -3. Okay, so if you just have capital R, x equals -3, that's okay. Or you can put those parentheses there, KPR. And you might see some of this here. That's just going to bleed through from the other side of the paper. Number 6, it looks like a translation, right? I'm just taking this whole shape here and just shifting it down to the bottom left section of the graph. So it's translation, capital T. If I count from A to A prime, I'm going backwards 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, -6, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. Be careful. I mentioned this when we talked about translations last week, that we're going backwards 3 and down 3. That would end you up at B, right? So you can't go from A to B prime. You have to go exactly from A to A prime. And then on number 7, here's our x-axis here. It looks like just a reflection. So I just said R, capital R, x-axis. All right, on these last few problems, we're doing the same directions as the last one. So we're writing the rule and identifying what's going on. So number 8, going from ABC here to DEF looks just like a basic translation. We're moving it 3 in the x direction, down 2 in the y direction. Remember that you could just say capital T3 -2. You could stop there. If you want to be fancy, you can put the ABC and the D equals DEF. That means we're going from ABC to DEF. But if you have this much, that's really enough to tell another mathematician kind of what's going on. So you could stop there. Number 9, we're taking ABC and we're moving it all the way over to IJK over here. So the simplest, kind of most direct way to do this is to move it in the positive x direction 11 units. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and your C ends up there. And then you just reflect or you flip everything over the x-axis. So remember that you have to do the translation second in the rule, and that tells a mathematician that that's what you start with, and then you reflect over the x-axis. Make sure you have that little circle there too. On sorry, that's a glide reflection. Number 10 also looks like a glide reflection. So we have D, E, F, and it's going to I, J, K again. So we're just going to shift it. It's very similar to the last one. We just shift it over only 8 this time, so it kind of ends up sitting right above it. And then it actually shares IK. It kind of shares that bottom of the triangle if we reflect it over y equals -1. And then it's just going to flip directly from the top here and then flip down to the bottom. Number 11, we're trying to take G, H, F and reflect it to I, J, K. And that's actually just a simple reflection. So if you reflect it over that line, x equals 3, kind of right through the middle there, that should end you up just right on top of triangle IJK. And that's it for now. So just a couple of quick reminders. On Wednesday, please make sure you turn in your 9.1, 9.4 review worksheet on Teams. There's not a new lesson unless you wanted to work ahead a little bit. On Thursday, we have the 9.6 dilations YouTube with the page 590 homework. And then on Friday, we'll go over that page 590 homework. And there will also be the chapter 9 review worksheet. And I'll send out a YouTube video about how to, like, the answer key for that one on Friday. So I'll see you guys later this week.